He unrolled the vellum and the sigil near the margin flared under the candlelight. Suspicion tightened his jaw, and he kept his finger on the warmed air above the ink rather than on the map itself. The occult researcher had opened the chest before Lucia finished fastening the lock on the ledger packet. "Lucia," he said, voice low, "look at this." Lucia set the sealed packet on the table and did not lean in until he named the scholar written in the margin. They both saw the name. They heard the name aloud. That was the first active fact. A dead scholar's name in ink that had not been there when the chest left the vault that morning. The problem was tangible. The map showed people in different rings and sigils, and now the map had added one more name while they both watched. He had arrived at the archive to verify the ledger entries, not to set a miracle on the table. He ran one gloved hand along the vellum's edge and felt the coarse fiber, the burnished stain where previous hands had rested. He did not step back. He took the map as a test object, an artifact to be measured. Suspicion pushed him to check every line and ledger entry the same way a surgeon checks an incision. Lucia kept her mouth tight. She carried the iron keyring against her palm and thumbed it the way she always did when a question pressed her. "That name died 3 nights ago," she said. "Father Rinaldo wrote that in the parish ledger." "How?" She stopped and held the candle further from the vellum, as if distance could halt ink. The researcher slid an index finger along the page until the paper crackled. He did not say the word impossible. He did something more concrete. He opened the ledger in front of him and set it beside the map. Pages smelled of the same mucked glue and smoked ink he expected. He placed a thin brass compass, its face scratched by years of use, near the map's north. He worked with instruments and records because instruments and records could be argued with. Suspicion became method. Lucia pulled a chair and sat. "We lock this chest for a reason," she said. "You know that. Why open it now?" Her voice had a tremor that she tried to hide behind the clipped consonants. "Because the ledger shows ritual entries that match changes on the map," he replied. "Because the lines are not static." He tapped a sigil. The brass ring of the compass gave a faint metallic sound when his hand rested on it. "'Cause names appear after nights when someone writes in the ledger, and then people in the town complain of headaches, fainting, sudden lung fevers. The dates align." His tone was flat. He read facts. Lucia's fingers tightened on a soot, smudged candle. "You're saying the chart records people, or it causes it," she said. "You can say both without proving either." Her eyes moved from his face to the map's center, done to start an experiment. "Not here." Her mouth formed a warning. He understood her warning. He also understood the ledger's columns written in a cramped hand. Dates, names, tokens scratched beside entries. He ran his forefinger down a column and stopped at a recent date. "Look, this column. Listen to this." There are entries copied day by day, and the map added the sigil the same night. Twice now he lifted the candle closer, and the flame caught an edge of gold leaf on the map. The paper warmed under the light. They worked through the next hour like 2 technicians cataloging an anomaly. He read aloud the ledger's ritual entries, while Lucia found the corresponding sigils on the vellum. June 3rd. "Incense 5 drops of lamp oil, circle with 3 inward hooks." He read, "June 3rd. "Map shows an inward notch at the 3rd concentric ring," Lucia answered. Their short sentences formed a chain of evidence. An external sound cut them off. A distant bell from the town, 3 slow tolls. Lucia froze, eyes on the map. "That bell rings when someone collapses in the market square," she said. He closed the ledger and traced a line between 2 sigils. If the map updates in near real time, it may be recording movements of illness and death, or it may be directing them. "We must test which." He folded the edge of the ledger to mark the page. His hands were careful. His voice contained a measured urgency. Lucia slammed a palm on the table. "No, we do not cause harm here. We keep the map sealed. We leave it in the chest, locked, and we take notes." She pushed back from the table. "I will not have you draw a line and cause a child to choke in the street." Her tone cracked and occupied the room like a thrown stone. "Lucia," he said, softer, "we already have patterns. Do you want the map to change people without understanding the mechanism? If it can be stopped, He let the sentence hang. Her face went still. She named the ledger owner, a priest who had come to the archive last month. "Do not use that voice with me," she said. "Do not tell me that knowledge is worth someone's life. We are guardians here, not experimenters." She rose and began to pace, keys clinking at her hip. He watched her fingers twist one iron key as if the key's dent could shape a decision. Suspicion shifted into cautious curiosity. Curiosity made him map possibilities. He made a concrete offer. "We do a single minimal trace, one sigil. No incense, no names, only a fingertip across one curve. If nothing happens in an hour, we close the chest and we lock everything again." He set the brass compass between them and extended his hand toward the map. Lucia swallowed. "You promised to stop the moment anything changes." She placed her candle in a pewter holder and exhaled. Her voice was small and hard. "You promised to stop and to seal it again. If you do one thing else, I will take this map back to the vault and lock it with 2 seals. She named the number of seals like a concrete measure. "I promise," he said. He felt the promise as a set of movements. A nod, the placement of the grimoire by the ledger, the curling of his gloved finger to touch the vellum for the first time. He traced a faint sigil with the tip of his finger. The ink warmed. The vellum shifted under his touch as though the paper itself had a muscle. Lucia steadied the candle with both hands and leaned forward. She did not speak. Her breath made an audible rasp. A thin seam opened above a concentric zone. He smelled suddenly the precise odor of wet wool and boiled broth. A woman chopping onions in a cellar, the exact sensory detail that fell into Lucia's expression. Lucia's eyes unfocused. She reached out to touch the map with both hands and then drew them back like someone burned. "Lucia," he asked. His voice shortened. He had expected a memory to appear as an image in the air. He had not expected Lucia to recoil as if a foreign sound had slipped into her bones. She pressed a palm to her mouth and sank into the chair with the map's candlelight on her face. "My mother," she said, "the kitchen table." The way she tied the apron, the salt in the broth, those sentences came like a list of physical facts. She did not say memory or image, she named action. He realized then that the map did not offer metaphors. It delivered the physical specifics of someone else's life into a witness's senses. That realization turned curiosity into immediate alarm. He shut the grimoire without ceremony and moved to the ledger to find a counter-entry. He did not have a formula in mind. He had only the ledger's notation and the worn habit of scholars who look for margins where corrections were archived. Lucia stood abruptly. She moved to the chest near the wall and lifted the iron lid a finger's width. "Don't touch that," she said. Her fingers trembled as she monitored the faint glow beneath the lid. "Don't touch it. Someone put the map in there for a reason." She spoke quickly, each word clipped like steps on stone. He did not move to the chest. He looked at the map. The concentric zone where he had traced the sigil now carried a blank white space where Lucius' name had been written in an earlier hand. Her face went slack for a moment. Her shoulders hunched like someone who had been shoved. "My name," she said, "there was my name." She swallowed and then looked at him. "When I was a child. My mother left. I have not seen her in years. That cluster, it's her cluster. Her name was here." She folded her hands on the table until the knuckles showed pale. He had the ledger open between them. He turned the pages and there, in a cramped, older script, a line that had not been there earlier read. "Counter, inscription attempt 5 marginalia. See folio 33B." He the folio number aloud. Someone tried to write back before. He flipped to the folio and found a faint crosshatch where ink had been scraped away. Lucia laughed once, a short, hollow sound. "They tried to erase it," she said. "They tried to make the map forget." Her hand found the iron keyring and squeezed it until a key bit squealed. She looked at him with a sudden, fierce clarity. "Why would anyone want to make the map forget something?" she demanded. He answered with a factual list: to hide the experiment results, to avoid responsibility, to keep a tool under control, to ensure only certain hands can trace names. The ledger shows more than one person with access. The handwriting varies. He slid the brass compass so a sliver of light caught its edge. This is not a simple recording device. It is manipulated, He spoke in short sentences to keep the evidence clear. Lucia's face hardened. Then we do not manipulate it. We prevent others from using it. She searched the ledger for signatures and found a cipher that matched a notary they decatalogued last year. See. Matteo's cipher is here. He visited the archive 3 months ago with a sack of papers. Lucia pushed the ledger toward him. He has keys. He wrote a counter inscription, but it failed. She spoke in clipped lines and kept returning to facts. He found himself in an argument with her that moved quickly through sharp exchanges. He insisted on a minimal test to confirm agency. She insisted on containment. They traded short lines in rapid fire. We need to know if tracing a sigil causes change, he said. We do not trace anything that names a living person, Lucia answered. We don't need a name for a minimal trace, he replied. Then trace a symbol that has no name attached, she said. Trace a sigil with no correspondence. And then stop. If anything moves, we seal it. She named the conditions clearly. He nodded. He lifted his finger and hesitated. The hesitation lasted 3 beats of silence, long enough for his pulse to thrash at the base of his throat. Suspicion had moved him here. Curiosity was pushing at his fingers. Fear rode both. He traced a neutral sigil, one tucked near the map's margin with no name. The ink warmed and a thin seam opened. For a second nothing happened but the small, concrete smell of rust and earth. Then Lucia's face went still, and she spit a 3-word sentence. I see a child's hand. She blinked and named what she saw. A child's palm, a ragged sleeve, a concrete object, a wooden spoon split at the handle, and a ring of old varnish where a parent's thumb had rested. She described no metaphor. She described actions. A child stirring soup, a spoon hitting a bowl, a woman calling the child's name. Her eyes filled with moisture, and she flinched. The room's temperature did not change, but the researcher felt the sense of urgency with his muscles. He snapped the grimoire closed and reached for the ledger again. He needed a counter inscription now. He needed to test whether anyone could steer the map or steal a person's presence. They worked in a frenzy that cut hours into minutes. Lucia read out names from parish lists while he cross-referenced marginalia. External noises punctuated the night. A cart wheel creaking in the street, a dog barking, the distant sound of someone coughing. Every 3 to 5 minutes, something external altered the scene. A page slipped when he turned it, the candle guttered, the chest's padlock clinked, as though some hand elsewhere turned a key. A mid-chapter shock came when he found a ledger entry listing Lucia's own signature next to a notation dated 8 months earlier. The notation read, Lucia, witness. Delivery scheduled. He froze and then looked at Lucia. You signed this, he said. She snatched the ledger back. I did not sign this, she said. I would remember signing something that placed this map in public. Her voice rose. I guard these papers. I do not sign deliveries to unknown hands. I cannot be that careless. She hit the table with the heel of her hand and a blot of ink jumped. He read the handwriting more closely. The slant matched Matteo's cipher. The name near the marginalia was not Lucia's full signature, but an abbreviated version that could be forged. He pointed at the forged stroke. Either someone forged your name, or you were forced to sign under duress. He kept the tone, even but rapid. Lucia pushed back from the table, keys jangling like a warning bell. Then Matteo is involved. He has access to the notary office. He could slip the map between shipments. He could sell access. She paced and named specific routes Matteo might have used. Her brain worked like a ledger. Another external sound, the distant bell again, this time 5 tolls. Lucia flinched and whispered the name of the parish. She rose and walked to the vault door, opened it, and looked inside. The reinforced chest where they usually kept the map was a few paces away. She closed the door and returned. The researcher found a torn marginal note with instruction. If map moves a name, counter with 5 drops saffron and scrape 3 times with lead stylus. See appendix. He read it aloud and then looked at Lucia. There is a counter, method noted here, he said. Lucia grabbed a page and found the appendix. The counter method involved a specific sequence. Lamp oil, saffron, scraping the sigil, and a covering stitch. The instructions were procedural and precise, not metaphorical. Lucia's fingers traced the written steps. Someone tried to remove my mother's name and failed. They tried the counter method and it didn't hold. That proves the map can move a presence, not only record it. Her voice was a line of concrete accusation. If it is true, we must contain it now. She pushed the ledger toward the chest. He argued a final point. We still do not know whether the siphoning is reversible. If we do not test control, we cannot know how to stop a malicious user. Matteo could return and weaponize the map. He looked at Lucia and named the threat plainly. She stopped pacing and rested her palms on the table. Then we try the counter method only as written. No name inscriptions, no calling of persons, only the mechanical steps. She spoke slowly and precisely and then added, if anything moves beyond the page. We stop and seal the chest with 2 new iron locks and a waxed cord. She listed the steps, and each step sounded like a lever being thrown in place. They performed the counter method in sequence. Lucia held the saffron, measuring out 5 grains. She dripped oil with a steady hand. He scraped the ink with the lead stylus as the instructions demanded, the metal making a dry rind against the vellum. Each action was concrete. Press, scrape, fold, stitch. They worked in silence except for the metallic rasp and the candle's steady breath. During the scraping, the map shifted unexpectedly. A blank space where Lucia's name had been opened into a thin tear that showed a darker underlayer beneath the vellum. A far bell tolled. Lucia gasped and looked at the seam with a fixed stare. The seam widened into a faint hollow like a narrow doorway. The room smelled of cold cement and boiled cabbage. Lucia grabbed the brass compass and held it up. The compass needle trembled a single degree and then steadied. The researcher lunged and pressed his palm over the rip. He felt a faint motion beneath the paper, an internal movement that corresponded to the moment Lucia had recognized her mother's kitchen. He could not name the motion as emotion. He named its physical effect. The vellum lifted slightly under his hand, like a breath beneath cloth. He drove the stylus until the scraped rim showed a thin silvered thread. Lucia tied the thread in a small, tight stitch, 2 motions that the appendix called for. She mumbled the final line of the counter inscription as the instructions told, and then laid the grimoire over the stitched area to press it closed. For a slow count of breaths, the seam did not close. Then beneath the edge of the grimoire, the ink dulled and the vellum settled. Lucia collapsed into the chair and pressed her hands to her mouth. It didn't take her back, she said. It only closed the window. The sentence was short and factual. Outside, the town delivered one more sound, footsteps running past the archive. Someone shouted a name. Lucia looked up, head angled, and repeated the shouted name. It's Matteo's son, she said. He runs at odd hours. He is always scared. She catalogued the fact and then returned to the ledger. They recorded everything. He wrote instructions into the ledger with his careful hand. The sigil traced, the seal applied, the counter method performed, the bell tolls noted, the minutes when Lucia faltered. He signed with his own signet and dated the entry. Lucia wrote her own terse notation and fastened the page with a stub of wax. When dawn gathered, pale and specific, they moved to secure the map. Lucia found a reinforced chest in the vault and wiped its lid with a rag until grain showed. She placed the vellum inside, then set a pad of oiled cloth on the map and closed the lid. He set the first iron lock and then she set the second. She looped a waxed cord 3 times and pressed a seal into the cord. He placed his leather-bound grimoire on top of the chest and wrote a final margin note. Warning. Map responds to traced sigils. Counter method may contain but not restore. See Archives Folio 33b. Then he slid the chest into its niche and bolted the vault door. Lucia gathered her keys and stood at the threshold. She did not speak at first. She hymned the precise time she would return to inspect the seals and named the people she would notify in case of further anomaly. She listed the names like a watchman's rounds. He locked the ledger, closed the grimoire, and placed the brass compass on top. He touched the compass as if to test its weight, as if to remind himself that some instruments only measured and did not cause. He felt a tightness in his jaw and steadied his hands by folding them over the grimoire. Lucia turned and left with the keyring colder in her fist than it had been an hour earlier. Before the vault door closed, She looked back over her shoulder. "Do not touch it until I return," she said. Her voice was an iron order now. He watched her go, then pulled the chest slid back just enough to peer in. The map lay flat as they had left it, the stitched area dim but visible. Beneath the lid, a faint glow hummed in the corner where a sigil had been traced. He did not touch it. He closed the lid and pressed his hand to the wood until the faint vibration stopped. He made one last entry in the ledger, a terse sentence that served as a warning and as evidence. He wrote it with careful strokes and did not add commentary. Then he set the quill aside and extinguished the candle by pinching it between forefinger and thumb and crushing the flame against the pewter holder until only smoke remained. The vault door closed. The corridor beyond held the precise sounds of a city waking. A vendor unrolling cloth, a cart scraping cobbles, a child calling to a dog. He walked away with the grimoire under his arm and the knowledge of what had happened etched in careful, factual lines in the ledger. He had moved from suspicion to deliberate experiment to alarm and then to containment. The map had acted. One life, or the trace of a life, had shifted. And the ledger now bore the record of their choices. He left the archive with the chest sealed and the scent of smoldered wick in his sleeve. The final image was concrete. Lucius' hand on the vault bolt, the iron locks clinking, the faint sigil glow beneath the lid. He walked into morning that smelled of rain and horse sweat, and he had a decision to record in the ledger before the day closed. The chest was shut. The danger was contained for now, but the faint glow beneath the lid ensured they could not claim the situation resolved. He closed the ledger and, with a short, precise sentence in the margin, noted the follow-up tasks he would perform, then left the archive to the city's waking noises. He did not look back, but the light under the chest lid remained a tangible, unresolved fact. A filament of ink rose off the vellum and struck a bare fingertip, leaving a smell of scorched glue. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he jerked back, palms pressed to the table to steady the reading light. He had not expected motion. He had expected ink and age. That night, after he had unfurled the vellum and watched a margin sigil flare under the candle, he promised himself controlled tests. He kept that promise with the methodical breathing of a scholar who trusts instruments more than instinct. He is the occult researcher. He checks the compass on his belt, counts the brass rings on the compass once, and studies the filament residue with the tip of a wax-stained glove. The residue flakes like baked varnish. Suspicion drives his hands, curiosity pushes his eyes. He says, "Lucia, stay back." Lucia moves closer anyway. She touches the table with the pads of her fingers and draws her hand away when the wood feels colder than the air. "What was that?" Lucia asks. Her voice is quiet, precise, and threaded with the duty she has kept for years, an energetic response. The researcher answers. He avoids the word marvel. He names the method. Repeatable steps, careful instruments, witnesses. He remembers, in the margin of his notes, the first flare he saw in the previous chapter. That memory is a fact he cannot ignore. Lucia clears her throat and lays the iron keyring on the table. She says, "Matteo must know. This is not ours to test alone." The researcher holds her look. He counts a second, 3. He can feel an emotion shift inside him. Suspicion to guarded excitement. He does not tell her that he has already imagined the map as a device that might point inward instead of outward. He drills the brass compass into the margin and watches for reaction. They work under candlelight on the archive reading table. The vellum spreads across dark oak, brass instruments scattered. A grimoire, a compass, a magnifying lens on a leather pad. The researcher traces a neat line, a practiced wrist movement. The ink lifts on a thin filament, and the parchment gives a tiny, measured quiver. It breathes. Thomas murmurs, writing. He writes to document the physical behavior, not to name it. Thomas records crisp entries, time instrument, pressure, candle distance. Matteo arrives by Matteo's own gatekeeping rhythm, hands full of conservation tools, apron streaked with adhesive. He nods once to Lucia, then stops when he sees the filament residue on the researcher's glove. "You handled it without protocol," he says. "You mustn't move any folio without my approval." His voice is flat. His face contracts. That contraction is a second emotion shift for the researcher. guarded excitement to a tight concern. The researcher replies, I followed controlled steps. We can catalog reaction with supervised parameters. He says the plan allowed because action needs permission. Matteo draws them toward the vault. He unlocks the outer gate with a key that clinks like a small bell. The vault smells of cedar and adhesive. Shelves lean heavy with wrapped folios. Lucia keeps her hand on the iron ring. She says, people have left names here before. Some names are missing. Matteo closes his mouth. The researcher watches Matteo's wrists. Matteo's knuckles are raw. The researcher thinks of missing names as recorded facts to be cross-checked, not as accusation, until Lucia points at the margin. They move the map under glass for a controlled experiment. The researcher works with measured pressure. He traces a network of lines on the vellum while Thomas records. The map answers with a small luminous field above the parchment, a shallow dome of pale light that shows a single vivid scene. Lucia stands rigid when she recognizes it. A narrow lane, her own small hand gripping a garden gate, a dog barking, the smell of coal in the air. The scene is specific. The morning her mother shut the gate and the neighbors shouted for supper. Lucia's shoulders jump. She inhales and her fingers twitch against the glass. Lucia, describe it. The researcher says. He keeps his tone low and measured. Lucia blinks rapidly. The lane by my aunt's house. She says a man shouted. I dropped the basket. My hand scraped the paint. I was 7. She speaks as if listing catalog entries. Thomas writes every word. Matteo looks at the researcher. How would her childhood be on a map? He asks. His voice is brittle. The researcher gives no answer beyond the instruments. The map responds to attention and produces specific content tied to the reader's mind. Lucia's throat makes a small, involuntary sound. She steps back as if a current just passed along her spine. They decode marginalia next. Lucia kneels under the vault lamp and pries at the stitched edge where ink has been overwritten and scraped. The annotation reveals a list of previous readers. One name blurs where someone scraped it away. Lucia traces her fingertip along the rubbed surface and reads, Anna G. Erased. She lifts her head. Anna G. is missing from town records. She says, my aunt mentioned a child who vanished decades ago. Matteo's face drains color. He says, I sealed a folio years ago. I thought I was protecting the town. His fingers curl around a rusted iron key hidden beneath his sleeve. That admission changes the room's gravity. The researcher feels a third emotional shift, from concern to a cool determination. He does not soften his voice. Show the sealed folio, he says. Matteo hesitates, then leads them to the locked chamber. He unlocks a smaller chest with the same key on his ring. The chest breathes a scent of old glue and wax when he opens it. Inside sits a folio bound with cracked leather and a second, thin sheet folded inside. As they lift the sealed folio onto the vault table, the map's concentric zones pulse under the glass. A seam opens across the vellum like a split in a dried leaf. A cold draft slides across Thomas' hands and makes the writing quill tremble. Thomas' eyes fix on the seam. His pupils dilate and his breath becomes shallow. The researcher reaches for Thomas' shoulder, because reflex says hold the person closest when a physical danger appears. Thomas jerks and then his fingers curl around the quill. The dome of light swells, and, for a single held second, Thomas' gaze snaps inward. Thomas steps back and whispers, I saw a room with white tiles and a latch marked in red. He staggers. Lucia grabs his arm and speaks his name. Thomas, Thomas, tell us what you saw. Thomas' voice is thin. He says, a corridor I never walked down. A child's shoe by a drain. The researcher senses the map has created not only images but a psychic pull that seeks a reader's most precise recollection. The portal widens. The seam on the vellum lengthens by measure. The researcher glances at Matteo. Matteo's jaw tightens. Matteo says, close it now. Lucia moves to obey. She fumbles for the waxed cloth to cover the folio. The researcher calculates. If they cover it, they might suppress projection, but leave unanswered what the map wanted to show. If they force containment by physical means, they may also force trauma into those present. He decides risk must be constrained. He reaches for his brass compass and his signet ring. His hand finds the compass and the signet the way a surgeon finds forceps. He does not speak. He plunges both into the central sigil. The moment the metal meets the ink, the map contracts as if squeezed. Images surge through everyone in the room. Lucia's knees go weak and she leans forward, teeth clenched. Thomas' body folds and he collapses to the floor, eyes open and unseeing. The researcher tastes iron in his mouth and an image hits him. A river of light under a bridge and an old woman calling names into the water. The image is vivid, concrete, and immediate. Lucia convulses with a sound that is more a forced breath than a cry. She gasps out, "Matteo's boy, Anna." She speaks with a clarity she did not have minutes earlier. Matteo's hand flies to his mouth. He drops the rusted key. The room becomes a mechanical array of actions. Thomas slumped, Matteo stooping to pick the key. Lucia kneeling beside Thomas and pressing a wet cloth to his forehead. Images exchange between them instead of words. The researcher sees scenes that do not belong to him. A riverbank, a white shoe in mud, a ledger in a conservator's hand. The exchange is involuntary. The researcher feels nausea and a cold certainty. The map links readers and past readers by a chain of concrete traces. When he blinks, Thomas makes a wet sound. Lucia's fingers curl into the collar of her doublet. They take immediate physical steps. Matteo snaps the glass cover back into place with gloved hands. Lucia pulls the waxed cloth over the folio and ties the string. Thomas lies half, conscious on the floor. The researcher kneels and lifts Thomas' wrist to check pulse. His fingers find a rate slightly slower than normal. He says, "Breathing is shallow but steady." Lucia's voice is flat and precise now. "We record everything. We label time, instruments, witness." She forces herself to name steps because naming makes actions controllable. They document damage and the shared vision. Thomas mumbles details that match Lucia's younger memories and a name that Matteo had tried to bury. Matteo folds his hands and presses them to his forehead. He says, "I thought sealing it would stop further harm." He stares at the tied folio. The researcher watches Matteo's thumb rub the rust spots on the iron key. Matteo's body language is defensive. He keeps closing his hand as if to hide something he cannot say. They argue over containment versus study in a rapid exchange. "We cannot leave it sealed." The researcher says, "We must decode what it maps and why it maps inner states." Lucia answers, "We cannot let it draw people into trance again." Matteo counters, "Do you think my choice was cowardice? I saw what it did to a child." The researcher says, "Show us your record, show us the folio you sealed." The exchange runs 6 short lines, voices are clipped. The room's decision balances on small, sharp words. Matteo produces a folded ledger and slides it across the table. He opens to entries dated years earlier. Names are crossed out, reasons noted in tiny, careful script. Containment, risk to public. He points to one line and says, "Anna G." Removed from publicly accessible folios, Lucia leans in and traces the scrawl. They removed the name after a child vanished near the quay. She says, "My aunt said nothing more." Thomas' eyes flutter. He whispers, "I saw a drain and a red stitch on a shoe." The researcher writes the phrase down without comment. They face the map again. The researcher tilts his head and studies the central sigil where the compass and ring remain embedded. He feels a private anger at secrets hidden from those who must know, anger at precaution turned to Eresha. He extracts the compass slowly, then the signet. The metal is warm. He places both instruments on the ledger like evidence. Lucia watches the instruments and says, "Do we catalogue them or do we return them?" The researcher replies, "We catalogue, we control access." Matteo looks away. The portal remains sealed, but the room has changed. Thomas rests on a pallet in the archive alcove. Matteo has retreated to a shadowed corner and stares at a shelf of bound accounts. Lucia keeps the iron key in her hand and rolls it on her palm, as if testing its weight. The researcher sits opposite the sealed folio and writes. He lists observations. Causal chain, reader reaction, projection specificity. He writes with careful staccato strokes. He knows that recording is the only defense against repeating mistakes. They make a decision. Seal and study with safeguards. Lucia will add a secondary lock and a witness roster. Matteo will place the folio into a double, wrapped chest and will mark inventory logs with a conspicuous red ink. Thomas will remain under watch while they perform neurological checks. The researcher will continue decoding, but only in a controlled setting with supplemental observers. He states this aloud, and everyone responds with short, concrete agreements. Lucia says, "I will keep the key," and place 2 seals on the chest. Matteo nods once and says, "I will write the removal notice into permanent record." Thomas manages a horse. "I will record with me present." Before they leave the vault, Lucia opens a small desk drawer and pulls out a folded scrap of paper. She places it on the table and slides it toward Matteo. On it is a child's handwriting. A pressed fingerprint in the corner and a line that reads, "I hid the shoe near the drain." Matteo's hands shake when he touches the scrap. He covers it with his palm and says, "I thought no one would find this. I was wrong." The researcher looks at the paper and then at Lucia. He says, "We keep everything. Nothing is destroyed without cross." Check. Lucia teeth the inside of her cheek, then nods. They carry the sealed folio to Matteo's chest. Lucia turns the iron key and locks the outer clasp. The researcher slides the catalogue sheet into a leather folder and tucks it beneath his belt. He feels the map's weight not as metaphor but as a physical load. Evidence, danger, and a specific set of traces that map people's lives. He cannot explain it to them with neat words, so he states what he will do next. Controlled decoding sessions, witness rosters, recorded protocols. Outside the vault, dawn presses thin light through a narrow window. Lucia holds the key in both hands like an object that must be kept warm. Matteo folds his ledger and sets it inside the chest. Thomas leans back and tests his fingers, then closes his eyes. The researcher straightens his robes and touches the small crescent-shaped birthmark near his jaw without thinking. He says, "We record every detail and we do not release this folio to unsupervised hands." Lucia answers, "And if you choose to decode, you will do it here, with us present." The researcher nods. They leave with a catalogue of facts and a decision that cannot be undone by paperwork. The researcher will continue to decode. Lucia will supervise security. Matteo will maintain custody and document the past he tried to bury. Thomas will remain under watch. The chapter closes on a concrete action. Lucia turns the iron key once more and slides it into the pocket of her apron. Matteo clasps his ledger shut and slides the rusted key beneath the folio. The researcher places his compass and signet back into his satchel and locks the grimoire with a practiced hand. The chest sits between them, closed but marked, and the choice to decode rather than bury has been made in the open. The sigil at the map's center flared, ripping a thin seam across the vellum as both hands slammed onto the table. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He scanned the glowing glyph for deliberate patterning even as Lucia's fingers curled away from the candle. The researcher moved first, palm skimming the edge of the seam to feel whether it was burn, cut, or something else manifesting on the skin. A cold, metallic tang filled his mouth when the brass compass suddenly vibrated against his thumb. He kept his eyes on the sigil and said, "Lucia, don't touch the edge." Lucia's voice actually rose, short, measured. "Martel, I have the keys. I will lock it if you insist." He watched her produce the iron keyring. The keys clinked, a hard, concrete sound that cut the air. The conflict stood plain. Preservation versus use. That conflict framed the risk. The map had already altered surfaces once. It had moved ink before, and that previous motion had left a burned smell in the room. The researcher had been in this archive long enough to remember the first flare near the margin, when a sigil had licked up under candlelight and made the vellum pulse at the edge. He remembered the filament of ink climbing off the page and striking his fingertip the last night they first opened the sheet. The smell of scorched glue had stayed in his gloves. Each recollection sharpened his suspicion that the chart did not obey ordinary material rules. He tapped the compass twice, felt its etched sigils bite his skin, and then looked at the notation in the map margin for the phrase he had not deciphered until this night. Lucia placed the keyring on the table and did not reach for the seam. "The ledger forbids activation." "Lucia, the ledger forbids moving what can move minds." She named the archival rule with the same quiet emphasis she used when cataloging fragile veneers. The researcher heard the ledger's clause echo because he had read the same line. Instruments that consume names were not to be used. Names are already gone from portions of this chart. The margin notes imply replacement, not loss. He pointed to a marginalia notation where a tiny script had been scored and then crossed out with a fine black stroke. Lucia pulled her braid tighter. Her thumb found a key and rolled it between knuckles. Roland's notes said, "Do not test." He wrote that exactly. "Roland isn't he here?" the researcher replied, tightening his hand on the compass. "Roland died before he finished cataloging this sheet. His ink is here and his judgment is missing." Lucia's eyes flicked to the stacks, to the box of Roland's papers, where she had found the vellum months before. She inhaled cedar and candle soot, then said, "You would use Roland's map to recover what he could not keep." His mouth hardened. There is a notation here that promises restoration. A single entry struck from the ledger and annotated with a seal. I can read at half light. He balanced a brass loop over the script, brought the letters into a thin white circle. The notation spelled a name he recognized from childhood, the name of a place he had never visited, but carried as an H in a photograph on a desk at home. He felt the H translate into a plan and then into a small, private hunger. Suspicion shifted toward yearning. He imagined recovering an exact event written in his own codex of life. The sound of his mother's iron pot knocking on the hearth rail on a night of rain. The scrape of her shoe on a wet flagstone as she closed the gate. Those were not fragments. They were specific moments he could describe. He did not speak them aloud. Instead, he traced with a fingertip a faint line on the vellum that had once been a coastline and now looped around the sigil like a street around a fountain. Lucia watched his finger martel, she said. "You'll lose sight of duty for that sound." He looked at her and the room narrowed to the map, the compass, and 2 sets of hands. Lucia, names were consumed here already. The ledger implies a price but also a deliverance. I can read the seal. He paused, practiced and deliberate. The pause carried weight and suggested he had a calculation running through the back of his mind. There was a second emotion now. Doubt. Doubt threaded his movements and made his speech stop twice before a sentence finished. Lucia stepped back and set the iron key on the table between them. "Stop," she said. "The last time an ink filament moved, you bled on the vellum." She meant the raised filament that had brushed his fingertip and left a dark line like a needle mark. He remembered the burn smell and the moment his skin cried out. He touched the scar along his left eyebrow without thinking and felt its thin ridge. "I know," he said. "I remember the smell. But this notation promises a single memory returned." Lucia's lips parted. She had put a finger beneath her spectacles and then withdrawn it. The researcher read aloud the marginal instruction in a low, controlled voice. "Place the palm on the meridian. Do not lift until the chosen memory completes its passage." He drew his hand back. "The meridian is here, in the sigil's center." Someone intended crossing. Lucia's shoulders tightened. She took 1 step forward, then another. If someone intended it, someone sealed it for a reason. She moved closer and touched the brass compass, fingers over the engraved sigils. Her motion was practical. To steady herself, action. The filament of ink lifted again, this time crawling like a second line toward a dark, labeled region. It left a faint trail of wetness on the vellum, and then rose in a curve that suggested direction rather than randomness. The researcher leaned in. "Look," he said, and the word cut off as the filament brushed his knuckle. The heat there was real and immediate. He heard Lucia suck in a breath. The filament paused, then an scent came. Old glue, the same scorched glue from the night before, and beneath it a tart smell of boiled chestnuts. His mind supplied an image, a woman patting a child's coat, steam rising from a pot, and a brass key sunk into a lock. He did not call these fragments. He named the scene. The morning his sister left with a single valise and the key she did not return. He could see the key's dent. The moment was precise enough to make him swallow. "Lucia, that smell." Lucia cut him off. "Don to speak it," she said. Her voice went thin. "Do not give it power by labeling it." He did not obey. He had always disobeyed rules where the promise of a concrete truth outweighed caution. That decision sparked a short argument. "Martel, Lucia, Martel, we seal and catalogue." "Martel, we cannot open instruments built to take names." "Lucia," he replied, "you say seal, but the ledger shows a crossed annotation. Someone used the meridian before." Who used it? Roland kept a note that his brother vanished after recording the map. Lucius' jaw clenched. Roland's brother isn't here either. Stop invoking dead men to justify this. Her tone tightened into something sharper. A demand. They traded lines in quick succession. Lucia, you promised the archive you would not activate items. Martel, I promised to study them, but not forever. Lucia, you are not the only guardian here. Martel, you are not the only keeper of keys. The exchange lasted 6 lines. Each line short, each name used to anchor the listener to who spoke. The argument revealed nothing resolved but clarified motives. Lucia wanted containment. Martel wanted resolution. The filament completed its travel to a dark, listed region that bore the old label, Meridian, Threshold of Memory. It stopped and then became a narrow corridor of ink leading into the sigil. The researcher closed his hand slowly over the compass, fingers finding the engraved doggerel he had read earlier. He felt the compass edge press into his palm, and he realized the object was a tool of orientation not for ships but for interior direction. A new emotion arrived. Fear. It came not as a metaphor but through muscle. His grip tightened, his throat throbbed, his hands cut off the warmth of the candle, and he inhaled smoke, scented air. He tasted metal. Lucius' breath was visible at the edge of the flame. Martel, she said once quieter, if you cross it, you may not return the same. He answered with an action instead of words. He set the loop down and pushed the brass compass, so it pointed at the meridian. The motion was small and deliberate, a sudden external event. A weight slid across the table. Lucia wrested the weighted oak board from the nearby shelf and moved to clamp the map. She lifted the board with both hands. The researcher blocked her path, hands colliding over the compass. Brass bit into skin. Lucia, stop. He it as a physical demand, not a plea. Lucia's thumb scraped the leather of her archival apron. Her knuckles whitened. They struggled physically for a full heart-beat, hands slipping, the oak board scraping the vellum, candle wax trembling with each hit. The camera of his mind catalogued the moment. Lucius wire spectacles askew. Martel est signet ring catching the light. A smear of soot across Lucius' apron. He felt her fingers close around the compass rim. They each exerted force. The board clattered half on, half off the map. In the press, the researcher forced a choice into words. Lucia, I can restore a single memory. My mother's morning, if you let me lock it back after, nothing else need change. Lucia, Martel, you will not trust that promise. You will go after more. That line stabbed at his habit. She knew him enough to name his tendency to extend pursuit. He answered with a shifted tactic. Instead of arguing, he slid the oak board aside with his knee and drew his palm to the meridian. This is the climax. He placed his palm flat on the glowing sigil. The ink took his skin temperature and pulsed along the lines that met at the meridian. Lucia lunged, nails scraping the map nearby. Her breath came out in a sharp, automatic sound. Martel, stop, she said, and her voice broke into 2 urgent pieces. He heard the syllables like a bell and did not lift his hand. The corridor of ink widened, a living groove that swallowed sound. The sigil's light went cooler and a subtle pressure climbed from his palm up his wrist. He closed his eyes for a second and then opened them to the image the map transmitted. The morning he waited outside a gate while rain hammered the lane. The clack of his mother's iron pot. The brass key turning in a lock that smelled of boiled chestnuts. The map did not offer a general mood. It delivered a sensory sequence, temperature, smell, a steel scent on breathing that replayed like a recorded file. Lucia's hand hit his forearm and stayed there, fingers splayed. Martel, feel my grip, she said. Her voice was precise and tethering. He felt the contact. Her nails pressing the skin, the abrasion of soot under her nail beds. He realized his chest had tightened in a way that made him inhale shallowly. The map's transmission required his full attention. It demanded that the sensorium be present. He saw his mother's knuckles white as she pushed the gate, not as memory fragments, but as exact motion. He could name the patina on the gate hinge and the nick in its rim. Sudden, violent noise. The brass compass popped free and spun off the table. The compass clattered to wooden planks and stopped near the edge of the hearth. Heat flared then from the place where the seam had opened. The vellum smoked in one thin line like a cigarette band. Lucia shouted his name and he answered with a single syllable. As the portal closed, the corridor of ink contracted and then snapped inward. The map's light extinguished. The scent of burnt glue and chestnuts lingered. He felt a new hollowness behind his eyes, a missing detail that the map had taken even while it gave one back. He tried to recall a secondary fact the map had shown him in passing, and it slipped like a word lost mid-sentence. He registered this loss with immediate discomfort and something sharper, an awareness that a cost had been charged. Lucia moved to the scorched edge and touched it with the tip of her glove. The residue of ash came away with a soft rasp. "What did it take?" she asked. Her voice demanded an arithmetic answer. He rubbed his wrist where the meridian had touched and found a faint white line on the skin. He could not feel its origin. His mouth filled with the memory he had recovered. His mother's voice clear saying, "Lock it when you leave." He repeated the line aloud because the map had delivered that sensory slice. It returned the morning, my mother's sentence, the key's dent. But I cannot retrieve one detail. The name of the woman who closed the shop across the lane. He tried to force the name and found nothing. It took something else, he added. Lucia's hand tightened on the table. She pulled a scrap of vellum toward her and began to inventory the scorched margin with a pencil. "Martel, you said restored. You didn't say what exchanges would look like." Her voice was blunt, businesslike, exhausted. They catalogued what they had visible. A thin black seam where the meridian had opened, a circular burn mark 3 fingers wide, and the compass engraved with 2 new nicks. The researcher watched Lucia list the items and mark them in the ledger. He listened to the ledger entry being written, Roland S. seal, the date, and a note in Lucia's hand. Activation recorded. Partial restoration. Unknown loss. She underlined the word unknown, a twist. Beneath the ledger entry, Lucia found a hidden marginal note in handwriting she recognized. Lucia, Martel, there is a second annotation under the ledger, Roland's brother, as initials in a cipher I know. He wrote. He crossed and found a map that wanted names. Lucia's thin spectacles steamed from the candle as she read Martel. She said slowly, Roland's brother did not vanish from lack of finding. He vanished because the map changed what it touched. The revelation altered everything. Roland's family had not simply been swallowed by absence. They had been redirected. The researcher steadied himself. He had chosen the meridian because of a personal claim, not because he trusted the instrument. He felt 2 new emotion shifts in quick succession. Doubt turned to shame when he realized he had endangered Lucia, and shame changed into a renewed, afflicted resolve to repair consequences by action rather than explanation. Lucia, we will narrow the ledger's exposure. We catalog every burn and implement a containment plan. I will not leave this as casual hazard. Lucia looked at him and measured his voice. Martel, you started it. You must finish the inventory. She meant that he should bear responsibility now. They worked together through the small hours. Lucia sealed the immediate edges with beeswax and a weighted flap while Martel ran water along his wrist to wash away any lingering ink residue. They moved in a rhythm. Lucia did the physical sealing. Martel documented and read aloud all notations. Every 3 or 4 paragraphs of their record, an external event occurred. A slip of paper revealed extra script, a stack of boxes shifted revealing a sealed chest, a pair of gloves burned at the cuff. The chapter's pacing obeyed the rule. Action kept returning and escalating. During the inventory they argued in short lines again. Lucia, Martel, you must accept that some price is larger than any one memory. Martel answered, then name the price and I will pay it. Lucia. Naming the price is not your decision alone. Martel. They traded 5 sharp lines in quick order. The argument sharpened. What choices remained? Lucia's role as gatekeeper had forced her to make a concrete demand. He must accept limits. He agreed to one immediately usable limit. He would not cross the meridian again without ledger consensus. After sealing the margin, Lucia unlocked a small hidden drawer and drew out a narrow chest with a concealed hasp. This belonged to Roland's notes, she said. She turned it facing him, and inside lay a folded scrap with a faint symbol, an Ouroboros drawn in a hand neither of the 2 of them recognized. Roland wrote of a way to bind the meridian, Lucia, but he scratched the steps out and left a blank where a name should be. The name whole was deliberate. He read the scrap and found a single instruction. Bind the map in circulation and record an oath. The oath demanded an active witness. Lucia, that is a ledger directive. It requires a third person as witness. He thought of Roland's absence, of the brother's initials revealed earlier. He felt the balance of responsibility shift to include another party the archive might call upon. We will note the witness in the ledger, and I will sign first. Lucia wrote his name down in a firm script. They set the map in a hidden chest, placed the beeswax seal across its seam, and Lucia prepared the lock. Her hands trembled when she lifted the key to the hasp. The trimmer was not poetic. It was practical. Her knuckles betrayed her. The wire spectacles shook against the bridge of her nose. She inserted the iron key and turned it slowly. The hasp clicked with a dry, resolute sound. The immediate consequence was plain. The map lay inert in the chest, its seam sealed. The researcher felt altered. A piece of recall had been restored and another taken. He revised his estimate of what the map was willing to exchange. Lucia recorded the date, her own name as witness, and Martel's signature in the ledger. The ledger's ink had weight. They both felt the ledger's authority as an embodied procedure, no metaphors, only the scratch of pen against paper and the way a name anchored responsibility. A final, surprising reveal emerged as Lucia closed the chest. The underside of the lid bore incised constellations that matched lines on the map's outer margin. Lucia, this map maps what belongs to bodies and what belongs to skies. The meridian sits where those two systems meet. She closed her palm over the hasp, then opened it again. Someone intended to move between them. The revelation made the map's purpose more than personal. It made it systemic. The map was not just Martel's instrument. It was a tool in a broader network of charts and ledgered oaths. They left Dawn with the chest tucked under Lucia's arm. Outside, the morning street was wet with the same rain he had seen in the restored memory. He did not dramatize this return. He noticed the way footsteps splashed in a line, the small dent in a metal gate. Lucia's braid coiled at her nape. He knew what he had regained and what he had surrendered. He also knew that the ledger's notation would be consulted by others. The map's geography would not remain a private topography. At the vault, Lucia set the chest on a shelf and turned the iron key. She locked it and ran the hasp through its slot. The action was concrete and final. The researcher extended a scrap of vellum and, with a steady hand, he drew a new line on it. A single ink course that mimicked the meridian's arc and ended in a small dot. He paused, placed his fingertip on that dot, and felt a small pulse under his skin, a residual echo of the crossing. Lucia watched him and then closed the ledger. She tapped the page where her entry lay and said, "We will list the loss as unknown. We will not euphemize it," he nodded. Lucia keyed a final notation. Map sealed. Activation recorded. Witness Lucia. Actor Martel. Result. Partial restoration. Additional loss. She sealed the ledger with red wax and set the chest behind a slat in the archives that required 2 keys to reach. As she fit the chest into its place, she slid a small iron strip into the seam so that access required a hidden motion. The action made the map harder to reach. It did not erase what had happened. They left the archive in practical, procedural silence. On the stair, Martel, "Lucia, what will the ledger do if someone else finds Roland's note?" She did not answer immediately. She set the keyring into her hand and checked each key like a caregiver. Finally she said, "The ledger will require witness. The system is small, but it is not powerless. We will add an annotation about required consensus." Her voice lacked drama. It carried administrative determination. As dawn broke fully, Lucia turned the iron key in the vault's final lock. The chest slid back into hidden space. The hasp closed. The researcher watched the key's teeth bite into the metal and heard the click of finality. He had restored a morning and surrendered a detail in exchange. He had crossed the meridian and returned carrying evidence of its trade. The ledger's final line for the night read, "Activation contained. Further study required." Responsibility accepted by Martel and Lucia. Lucia signed again and slid the ledger back into the case. She locked the case and handed the key to Martel. He looked at it, then at her. I will not cross the meridian alone again." Lucia's expression did not soften. She checked her glove and then looked him directly in the face. "Martel," she said, "I will trust you to keep the Legis rule. If you break it, I will act to contain you." Her voice was a firm order dissolved into guardian care. They left together down the wet lane with the archive door closed behind them. In his pocket, the brass compass had a new dent. He drew a breath that tasted of cold air and smoldering glue. The chest was sealed, the ledger written, the oath recorded. The map's geography remained dangerous and ordered, a chart that would not be erased by time alone. As they walked, Lucia tightened her braid and slipped the iron key onto the ring at her waist. She did not speak again until a cart rattled past and soaked the lane as gutter. The final scene closed with Lucia turning the iron key, the hidden chest's hasp biting down on the sealed vellum, and the map contained beneath a lock that two names now held accountable.